Hello, I'm Jack Perkins. Welcome to Biography. A man is handcuffed and padlocked into a metal canister filled with water. The curtain falls. 2 minutes pass. The audience begins muttering nervously. 3 minutes pass. They clamor for him to be released. 4 minutes pass. Some of them become hysterical, screaming that the man must be drowning. But of course, just as they begin to rush forward, the man steps out from behind the curtain, drenched and breathless. And who was this man? Harry Houdini, master magician and escape artist. Eric Weiss came to America as an infant, part of the waves of Jewish immigrants from Europe in the 19th century. He reinvented himself as Harry Houdini from Appleton, Wisconsin. Escape artist, magician, actor, loving husband and son. Harry Houdini was many things in his life, but his name will always be synonymous with the wonder of magic. Biography presents Harry Houdini. Houdini. His name still evokes magic, mystery, and the supernatural.
To this day, if you were to stop somebody on the street and say, name a magician, people would say Houdini, because the name has become synonymous with magic.
They made a movie about him.
Listen down there, listen. Nothing that man ever made can keep Houdini a prisoner.
But in real life, his daring escapes were even more fantastic and made him the most famous performer in the world.
Houdini was a man who was actually a symbol. No restraint could hold him.
When they call him the most popular magician, they really do him a disservice. I mean, he was a superstar.
Many thought he would make an escape from death itself.
He was really saying to everybody, you can't hold me down. I'm the escape artist. I'm Harry Houdini.
The story of Harry Houdini is elusive, which is exactly the way the master illusionist would have wanted it. The reason his story is so hard to pin down is that this magician's greatest feat was conjuring up much of his own life out of thin air. Houdini's father, Samuel Weiss, was a rabbi in Budapest. With the hope of a better life, Samuel preceded his family to America in 1874 and settled in the sleepy Midwestern town of Appleton, Wisconsin, where he struggled to establish a congregation. Samuel's wife, Cecilia, remained behind in Hungary just long enough to give birth to her third son, Eric, the future Houdini. Then Cecilia and her many children followed Samuel to Appleton. As Houdini would later tell it, Appleton was his birthplace. He liked the role of all-American boy, and this Wisconsin small town fit that image better than Budapest.
I think he was a little bit ashamed of his past. I think he came from very humble beginnings and great family love, and a great group as a family, but that he wasn't as great as his imagination wanted him to be. So he tried to achieve that through telling the stories.
One of his stories traces his skill with locks to his boyhood theft of an apple pie from his mother's locked cupboard, a perfect American tale. He was certainly an early fan of magic and of showmanship, though it's hard to believe, as he claimed, that in his theatrical debut in an Appleton backyard, he hung upside down and picked needles off the ground with his eyelids. Whatever else was true of him, he had an enormously close relationship with his mother, and he would rest his head on her breast whenever he was anxious. He would do it even as an adult. He was devoted to her, and he tried to make her life better.
He seemed to feel that she had gotten a bad deal in life. She fell romantically in love with a very dashing man, Rabbi Weiss, and she loved him till the day he died. And what that got her was many years of poverty and hardship. And he seemed very bent on making up for that.
Houdini decided to lighten his parents' burden with his very first disappearing act. He was 12 when he announced his decision to hit the road. "Dear Ma," he wrote, "I am going to Galveston, Texas, and will be home in about a year. Your truant son, Eric Weiss." While Eric was following circuses and sideshows, his family moved on to New York, which his father hoped could better support an old-world rabbi. But life here was little better than in Wisconsin. Eric joined his family in New York, where on one snowy day, while working as a messenger boy, he put his cap on the sidewalk with a sign, "Christmas is coming, the gooses are fat, please put a coin in the messenger boy's hat."
And when he had enough, he thought, to buy food and everything, he went home, and just before he arrived home, he had bushy hair. He placed all the coins in his hair.
And he said to his mother, "Shake me, I'm magic." And she did, and the money tumbled down.
He worked as a tie cutter and always claimed to have also apprenticed himself to a locksmith, whom he quickly outshone. Wherever he learned about locks, he was certainly an expert.
He said at one time that he could look at a key and a short time later could create a copy of that key. And I'm quite sure that he could, because he had an amazing memory, an amazing grasp of things mechanical.
During this period, the short, wiry Houdini began a lifelong obsession with physical fitness, joining those athletic clubs that would admit young Jewish men. Then, in 1889, Harry read a book that would change his name and his life forever after.
When he was about 15 years old, he read the autobiography of Robert Houdin, this French magician.
The 19th century Frenchman Jean-Eugène Robert Houdin took magic from the streets and sideshows of France into the grandest theaters in the country. Well, this notion of magic as a respectable profession had enormous appeal for Harry.
He came to work at the necktie factory, and he said to the boy who worked next to him, Jacob Hyman, "I want to be just like this guy, Robert Houdin." And Jacob Hyman, picking up on Eric Weiss's, Houdini's mispronunciation, said, "Well, you know, if you add an I to Houdin, it'll mean like Houdini in French. Houdini."
He also took the name Harry. It probably came from the Yiddish Eri, his mother's pet name for the young Eric. And now the rabbi's son, Eric Weiss, was ready to thrill the world as Harry Houdini, master illusionist. Harry formed an act with his brother called Dash because of his dashing appearance. The highlight of their act was the metamorphosis, the substitution box trick. Dash performs the trick here in rare film footage shot in the 1920s. Dash has been tied in the sack and secured in the trunk. The trunk and the lovely assistant then disappear behind the curtain. When the curtain opens 3 seconds later, it is Dash who is outside the trunk, and inside the trunk, in the sack, is, ta-da, the assistant. Harry and Dash performed in dime museums all over town, including stints at Coney Island. Dime museums were the lowest form of entertainment, offering 10 full acts for one thin dime. It was during their run on Coney Island that Harry met Wilhelmina Beatrice Ronner, or Bess, one half of the song and dance team, the Floral Sisters. The two of them fell in love.
They kept company for a while, and though she was Catholic and very strictly brought up in the Catholic traditions, and he was evidently very Jewish, the two of them hit it off very well, and much to the consternation, the initial consternation of their parents, they did marry.
Remarkably, Rabbi and Mrs. Weiss accepted the Catholic Bess as a daughter-in-law, but Bess's mother refused to acknowledge their scandalous marriage.
She couldn't believe it. An actor and Jewish? I mean, you just didn't do this sort of thing.
Harry now had a wife and a new partner. The slight Bess fit much better than Dash into the metamorphosis box and soon replaced him. And so their first show was set. Harry working alone with his card tricks and handcuff escapes, and with Bess on the box trick. Their first stop was the circus.
Houdini and his wife Beatrice were really a product of the circus and the sideshows where he did magic. But he also worked the mining camps, he worked the Indian reservations, he worked fairs, and of course he worked in P.T. Barnum's Dime Museum.
P.T. Barnum's Dime Museum was the preeminent sideshow, and from its unique performers, Harry picked up many of the skills he would later use on his own act. From the armless wonder, he learned to untie knots with his toes. From a Japanese acrobat, he learned the art of regurgitation, useful in hiding and retrieving keys. But Harry's forte was still traditional magic. He was working on a handcuff act, but for the moment, as the king of cards, he struggled at the bottom of the bill, outclassed by more compelling acts such as Emma Schaller, the ossified girl.
He stayed at the very bottom rung of the show business ladder for 6, 7, 8 years. And he once referred to himself as Dime Museum Harry. It was breaking his heart, and at one point, he decided to chuck it.
He promised Bess he'd look for steadier work, perhaps as a locksmith. But he wanted one more shot. It was in a dressing room in the Midwest in 1899 that Harry had a visitor who would change everything for him.
The man took him out for coffee after the show and said, you know, if you demonstrated some show business in your act, you'd have something. That trunk trick you do with your wife is wonderful, and that handcuff thing you do is wonderful, but the small magic is not really worth your while. Houdini had this attitude of, who are you? Well, I'm Martin Beck, the man said, and I'll book you as a headliner. And that was his break.
Martin Beck, the vaudeville impresario, knew what Houdini's act could become. He booked Harry on the prestigious Orpheum circuit, guaranteeing him steady work for the first time. He also convinced Harry that escape, not magic, was where his future lay. And so Harry Houdini, now the handcuff king, began work on a series of tricks that would soon alert the world to the existence of the great Houdini. Harry Houdini, the handcuff king. That was how the public first came to know him at the turn of the century. But he knew he needed an angle, and that angle was to challenge the audience to supply the handcuffs. He issued challenges to any and all comers. He would pay $100 to anyone who could produce a pair of cuffs from which he couldn't escape. With the rudimentary handcuffs of the day, that was a safe bet.
Handcuffs always have been rather simple mechanisms. You see, one of the requisites of handcuffs is that any one make has one key that will open all of that particular make. So if you have a set of keys or a collection of keys, you can essentially open any handcuff. Of course, the skill is in A, knowing where that key is and how to get to it, and B, being able to manipulate it when perhaps they're on behind your back, face to face or some such thing.
Harry's secret was preparing for almost any set of cuffs he was presented with by hiding a variety of keys and lock picks on his body. When a particularly tough set was offered, he had them fastened high enough on his muscular forearms to simply slip them off over his hands after he'd opened all the others.
The audience didn't want him to fail. They weren't against him. They felt they were sort of, I'm going to catch him. I'm going to fasten him up so he can't get out. But they were gladdest of all when he did do it because he represented them. He was one of them. He was a nice guy, and he was up there winning for them.
Houdini never referred to himself as an escape artist. He was a self-liberator who embodied the struggles of his fans, immigrants freeing themselves from the old world shackles.
He was really saying to everybody, I'm like you. I have things opposing me. I have things constraining me. Things that draw me back tend to keep me down, and it was a period of history when that was very evident. But I can beat them all. You can't hold me down. You can't restrain me. I'm the escape artist. I'm Harry Houdini.
More dramatic was escaping from jails. Houdini proclaimed that no cell existed that could hold him, and when he hit a new town, he'd visit the jailhouse and arrange to be locked up the next day. On his visit, he would stash a piece of wire or skeleton key in the cell, often under the cell door's lock itself, as he appeared to examine it. The escape always worked. On the day of the escape, he would add to the drama by demanding to be strip searched. there was more than a bit of sexuality in the follow-up photos of the strip search. Like the photos of the naked Houdini in chains, they were publicity bonanzas, and Harry knew perfectly well their power to sell tickets.
Well, if Houdini were alive today, one of the things he might be cashing in on is the fact that bondage in S&M is getting so huge, and that he was the first male entertainer to appear naked and use that for front page. I mean, he was a little built guy who was butt-ass naked with some chains hanging down in front of his little Houdini.
It was time now to see if his act would travel to the old world itself. On May 19th, 1900, Harry and Bess sailed for London. The voyage was a miserable one. Harry could not escape from the heaving, tossing ship. He lost 10 pounds to seasickness. On their arrival, Harry set about finding a challenge that would win the public's attention. He fixed on a handcuff escape from the citadel of police work, Scotland Yard.
And the superintendent clapped the cuffs on Houdini, hugging this concrete pillar, and they walked out saying they would be back when the young man was exhausted or some such thing. And as they got to the door, they heard the clatter of cuffs on the floor and turned to see Houdini leaning against the pillar, grinning at them.
Houdini knew that English cuffs opened when struck in a particular way. With this success, his European triumph had begun. In Russia, he really captured the public's heart by escaping from a van that transported prisoners to Siberia. In Germany in 1901, he packed the houses again. One misguided cop from Cologne claimed in print that Houdini was a fraud. An American Jew escaped from the Kaiser's cuffs? It was laughable. Well, Harry sued, and in higher and higher courts, he extricated himself from ever tougher restraints. He won his case and more spectacular publicity. Rare footage captures the act that thrilled Paris. Houdini jumped handcuffed into the Seine. Understanding the publicity power of the newsreel, he surfaced again and again until he was perfectly placed in the middle of the frame. After all, as he wrote around this time, the secret of showmanship consists not of what you really do, but what the mystery-loving public thinks you do. But the challenges were getting harder and harder. In 1904, the London Daily Mirror tested Harry with a very special pair of handcuffs.
After they'd been placed on his wrists, he said, "I have been placed in a handcuff which it has taken a British mechanic 5 years to make. I do not know whether I can escape or not, but I can assure you I'm going to try."
Harry tried for more than an hour to free himself. Even Bess was becoming concerned.
And the story is that Bess ran on stage to give him a glass of water and kissed him, and at that point slipped a key into his mouth, and he managed to get the key into the cuffs and escape.
He had a genius for setting these things up so that they looked spontaneous, so it looked like he was in trouble, so it looked like he wasn't going to get out. And if he hadn't been able to convey that to an audience, he wouldn't have been the success that he was.
And he was a smash hit everywhere. By 1905, he had become the highest paid vaudeville entertainer in Europe, and his new wealth allowed him to shower gifts and attention on what some have said was his truest love, his mother. Harry threw her a lavish reception in her native Budapest, a chance for her to show the town what a success her son had become.
My personal opinion is that Harry Houdini was what we call, and I'm trying not to be unkind about it, a mama's boy. He was totally dedicated to his mother, and apparently there was good reason for that. He was one of a very large family. His mother really apparently slaved and sweated to support them.
By all accounts, Harry's devotion to his mother was accepted by Bess with equanimity. It was of show business that she was becoming jealous.
I think that Bess sort of fell out of love with show business, not with Harry, but with show business, and sort of resented the fact that show business owned him much more than she did.
Whether children might have helped the relationship is impossible to say. One theory has Harry sterilized by X-rays. Harry's brother Leopold was New York's first radiologist. The two X-rayed themselves frequently. Another theory suggests that Bess was unable to bear children. And some say Harry would simply never have stood for any rival for attention.
He went through life with pretty much everything focused on Harry Houdini. Anything else or anybody else was actually unimportant and insignificant.
However self-absorbed Houdini was, surviving footage shows what a pleasure it must have been to see him at work, to watch his absolute confidence and mastery of his craft. And showing the effort that went into freeing himself was one of Houdini's secrets of winning over an audience. They saw it, but could hardly believe it.
I think his evocation of wonderment was really the key to his success. One of the things that he loved to do was to make an impossible situation and theatrically make you believe it was impossible, and then break that frame in such a way that it was not only entertaining, but it was full of impossibility, that he had achieved the greatest escape.
By 1905, Houdini's great escapes had conquered Europe. Now it was time to astound audiences at home with new escapes, from packing crates, straitjackets, and his marvelous Chinese water torture cell. (1905). Houdini was a genuine star now as he moved with his wife and mother into a 26-room townhouse in Harlem. He wasn't home for long. Determined to remain a headliner, he perfected the packing crate escape. A perfectly ordinary crate would be nailed shut and dropped into a body of water. What the crowds couldn't see and didn't suspect was the small pair of nail cutters Houdini carried with him. As the crate sank, he quickly cut enough nails to loosen a few of the boards. Still holding his breath, he would squeeze out through the gap he had made and then refix the loosened boards. And both Houdini and the box would emerge intact. It stunned the crowd every time.
I mean, really what Houdini was doing, he was acting out death and resurrection. In the Egyptian myth, wasn't Osiris locked up in a box and thrown into the Nile? And it's not too far away from what Houdini was doing every day of his life.
Another certain crowd pleaser was the straitjacket escape, which Houdini pioneered. He had become fascinated by straitjackets on a visit to an insane asylum. This publicity film shows how theatrical the act was, but the escape took very real study, strength, and concentration.
The big trick to getting out of a straitjacket is that straitjackets are made to contain crazy people. And crazy people aren't really good at doing things in a specific order. And to get out of a straitjacket, you need to do a series of skills that are physical and are mental, and you need to do them one after another without panicking.
At first, Harry did the escape hidden in a cabinet, but he soon realized the power of shedding the jacket in full view. The straitjacket escape was wonderful publicity for the rest of Harry's act. In every town, he could guarantee he'd fill every seat in the theater by first performing the straitjacket escape outside, free of charge, not on a stage, but suspended upside down above the crowd. Life stopped as huge numbers of people came to watch. In a number of towns, the police reported that pickpockets had a field day, since everyone else was staring up at Houdini mesmerized. Still, the escape always thrilled the crowd.
He would draw crowds of 50,000. 50,000 people are late to work and their bosses say, why? And they say, well, Houdini was getting out of a straitjacket.
And with his natural genius for publicity, Houdini often performed the act suspended from the local newspaper office, thus ensuring front page coverage. Another sensation was Houdini's escape from a milk can filled with water. Handcuffed, he would be submerged in the can and the lid would be locked on.
He would say before he went into the milk can, "When you see me take a breath and submerge my body beneath the water, just before the lid is locked on, I want all of you in the audience to draw that same breath. Hold it as long as you possibly can, and when you are forced to let out that breath, at that point you would commence drowning." Now, that's an enormously effective gimmick, because people in the audience would take their breath in, and then when they got blue in the face and had to let out, they'd say, "The can is still sitting there, and he hasn't budged. He must be drowning now, unless he can do it much longer than I can." And then time would go by, another minute, another 2 minutes, another 3 minutes. They say, "By now, he surely is drowning." And they empathize so strongly, people would be shouting in the end, "Let him out, let him out." And then suddenly, bang, he would bust through the front of the curtain, dripping wet and heaving his breath very, very deeply, because he'd wanted to give them the impression that he had just that second emerged from the... He might have been out for 3 minutes already. He would get a standing ovation on that each and every time, without fail.
In fact, Harry was really safely inside an inner can, and half rivets on the outer can allowed him to escape. He'd then sit backstage and read the local newspaper until he felt it was time to make his dramatic reappearance. But on at least one occasion, he ran the risk of being caught.
The newspaper was being turned so loudly that one of his assistants came up to the side and said, "Harry, turn the pages quieter, the audience can hear you." And Houdini said, "I'm not finished yet. Tell the orchestra to play louder."
The milk can escape was followed up by a trick that combined the best elements of all those preceding it, the Chinese water torture cell. To this day, the only people who think they know how it was done won't tell. Houdini's legs would be shackled, and he would then be hoisted up and lowered into a metal cage in a water-filled mahogany tank, and the top would be locked on.
It certainly was a brilliant idea, because it took the whole idea of being submerged underwater, that he started by doing it as a publicity thing in rivers, then the milk can where he was completely out of sight, and then in the water torture cell he's upside down and visible because the front of the cell is glass, so the audience can see him under the water. It certainly was a brilliant piece of theater.
With the water torture cell, Houdini firmly established himself in the pantheon of great magicians. By 1915, he was the highest paid performer in vaudeville. He could revere older magicians, pioneers like Harry Keller, seen here with Houdini and his brother Dash in rare footage, showing them some of his famous rope tricks. And Houdini also revered the magicians of the past and visited their grave sites.
Houdini found the graves of dead magicians in the places he played around the world. If the graves needed upkeep, he would see to it that they were restored and put in shape. He thought that magic was an art, and he thought that his practitioners should be remembered. Well, there may have been one other little aspect. Somebody once asked a famous New York magic dealer and magician, Al Flosso, what kind of magicians did Houdini like? And Al said, dead ones.
The living ones were definitely more problematic. Harry's main rival during his heyday was Harry Blackstone.
I once asked my dad, I said, "What kind of a magician was Harry Houdini?" And my dad laughed and said, "Harry Houdini couldn't put his hands in Central Park without rustling the leaves." But I think that was part of that old problem that they had about the jealousy of each other. You see, as one would go into a town and sometimes the other one was in the same town performing at the same time, they had what they called paper wars. Houdini would put up his posters and my dad would go out and put his posters up over Houdini's, and Houdini's paper hanger would go out and paste the billboards up over my dad's and so on, and the one who was out there last was the one who got the most publicity.
Staying in the public eye sometimes demanded more than magic. It was 1910. Aviation was still in its infancy. Houdini flies. It would be a publicity windfall. And so he took with him on an Australian tour a plane he had bought in Germany for $5,000. No one at all had flown in Australia yet. Harry would be its first aviator. There were a couple of crashes, but on March 16, 1910, Harry successfully flew 1 mile at Digger's Rest near Melbourne. A rival pilot claims to have flown the distance a day before, but it's Harry Houdini who had the newsreel cameras there and who thus entered the record books. Harry also used the tour to learn to drive. Having accomplished 2 more feats, Harry left Australia never to fly or drive again. What was left to conquer? Another world, also magical. Movies. It's 1919 now, and Harry Houdini has decided to try his luck in the newest branch of show business, motion pictures.
It was the thing. It was the cutting-edge technology, and Houdini wanted to be part of it because he wanted to be part of whatever was on the cutting edge. And also, I imagine that Houdini also was thinking that he might be more famous for a longer period of time. That was a big obsession of Houdini's.
His first effort was a 13-part serial, The Master Mystery. And of course, each episode had a cliffhanger ending. The improbable plot had the evildoers led by a not totally convincing robot. Houdini foiled the bad guys as only he could. He pulled out his old packing crate escape and worked it into the plot. And he showed the amazing agility he still held as a 46-year-old when he strangled one crook with his legs and then opened the door with his toes. The films were successful enough for him to form his own motion picture company, and typically he made it a one-man operation.
When Houdini did anything, he did it completely, and he was, when he did his film corporation, the writer, the producer, the director, the star. He did everything himself because he felt that this was a Houdini project and Houdini should do it.
The Houdini Picture Corporation's first project, The Man from Beyond, had him chopped from under the ice after 100 years. His spirit reanimates him and he heads off to find his lost love. His journey takes him to Niagara Falls, where he must save his girl in a valiant rescue, a scene that required a series of extraordinary stunts, all of which Houdini performed himself. Houdini loved the movie business and the chance to hobnob with stars like Charlie Chaplin and the other lions of Hollywood society. But his films were only moderate financial successes and critical disasters. Criticism never sat well with Houdini, and he left the film business in 1924. Another interest of Houdini's was now becoming an obsession. It dated from the death of his mother in 1913. For a long time after, Harry had been disconsolate.
He was just demolished emotionally by this news because he had been so close to his mother. And it was many months before he even thought about working again.
I think that the death of Houdini's mother triggered off and promoted rather quickly his interest in spiritualism and the possibility that maybe there is survival after death.
In his refusal to accept his mother's death, he began to seek out spiritualists who claimed to be able to contact and communicate with the dead. Houdini befriended a well-known proponent of spiritualism, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, author of the Sherlock Holmes mysteries and a fierce believer in the supernatural. But he found he could not share Sir Arthur's trust in spiritualism. Houdini sincerely wanted to reach out to his dead mother, but he found every spiritualist he turned to a charlatan, and their deceptions infuriated him. His magic was to entertain, theirs to swindle.
You can just imagine Houdini having the knowledge of trickery coupled with the grief of his mother's death and then seeing people prey on that. He must have went ballistic.
Houdini decided to wage an all-out war to expose the spiritualists and their tricks. Their eerie spirit photographs were really just double exposures. Houdini photographed himself with Abe Lincoln to prove his point. And disguised as Mr. White, using the anglicized version of his real last name, Weiss, he traveled the country attending seances.
At the point of the seance where he had gathered enough evidence to prove fraud, he would jump up dramatically and lights would be turned on and he would pull off his wig and say, "I am the great Houdini. I have exposed you as a fraud."
There's no question that Houdini understood the publicity value of his campaign. What better performance from the master illusionist than exposing villains who used illusion for selfish ends?
You must realize that exposing the spiritualists from the stage in his show was not just acting out a private obsession, it was also very good show business. And he was able to pack theaters by doing that.
But it wasn't just show business. Houdini appeared before the House of Representatives in 1925 to testify against the spiritualists. And it is this insistence on separating the theatrical from the fraudulent for which Harry Houdini is often most fondly remembered.
When the spiritualist movement was really rocking, which is during Houdini's time, Houdini could have jumped on that bandwagon in a second. He could have got all the headlines in the world by saying, "Houdini, escape artist, uses real mystical powers to accomplish this." He could have said, "I can read minds, I can do all this stuff, I'm in touch with the spirits," you know? And he would have gotten more money and had a better year. But we wouldn't be talking about him now. We talk about him now because he said what was in his heart. And what he knew was in his heart was, there's no ESP, there's nothing supernatural, that's all just lies. You know, the truth is, there's showbiz and there's tricks, and I'm here to tell you.
But his other performances were far from over. In 1926, he traveled the country with a full-scale show which included an elephant disappearance trick. His assistant on that tour was a woman who would miraculously appear inside a large radio, Dorothy Young.
It was made so even though he showed there was nothing underneath, there was about that width where I was absolutely flat, holding my breath. And then he would close the top, and that was my cue. My one foot would come out of the radio, and then the other, and I'd kick them together. And the radio would say, like, for instance, Pittsburgh, KDKA, Miss Dorothy Young doing the Charleston. And I would do this wild Charleston.
Houdini's niece remembers how spectacular these shows were and how impressive her uncle.
They had a big orchestra in the pit, and the orchestra would be playing until the show started. Then all of a sudden you would hear Pomp and Circumstance, and it'd go, na, 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 and the spotlight shone, and he strutted down the center aisle. He looked 7 foot tall to me in his tux, and all the way down to the front, and then up the steps, and turn around and hold out his hands. And he didn't even do anything yet, and the people went wild. He had so much charisma. Just holding out his hands, they fell in love with him.
He used to walk on stage sort of swaying like a sailor and looking like a muscle builder that had just gone through a workout, peel off his coat, walk up to the front edge of the stage and say, "I'm Harry Houdini, and I can beat any guy in the house."
One night in Montreal, he was between shows when 2 students went backstage to take him up on another of his well-known boasts.
So he's in his dressing room, he's reading his mail, he's going through it. Apparently one of these students said, "Mr. Houdini, I understand that I could punch you as hard as I want and it wouldn't bother you." And he said something like, yeah. He wasn't listening, and he didn't have time to tense his muscles up, and apparently the student hit him in the stomach, which ruptured his appendix.
He continued his tour until the ruptured appendix and the resulting peritonitis were diagnosed. Houdini languished in the hospital for 2 days.
He opened his eyes on that Halloween day, 1926, and said, "I'm tired of fighting. I think this thing is going to get me." And 1:26 p.m., Harry Houdini, the great escape artist, entered a realm from which there is no escape.
They kept saying Houdini died, because I heard the extras in the streets yelling that. And I mean, you wouldn't believe the fuss that was made about it. The people were, that's all you heard, no matter where you went.
I think there was a great outpouring of grief and love for Houdini. He was part of everyone, part of the American dream. He represented that part of us that just wants to break out and be free. He was all of us.
But inevitably, the world wondered, could Houdini somehow escape from death itself? Harry Houdini was dead, but many were certain he'd have something to say from beyond. In fact, he had told Bess that his death would be the last and best test of spiritualism. If anyone could cross the final boundary, it would be Houdini. And just in case, he had given her a code that only she could understand. For 10 years, she kept the vigil, and then, October 31st, 1936, she gathered some of Harry's friends for one last attempt.
It is the spirit of Houdini we wish to contact. We have waited, Houdini, oh, so long. Never have you been able to present the evidence you promised. And now, this is a night of nights. Levitate the table, move it. Lift the table, move it, rap on it. Spell out a code, Harry, please. Mrs. Houdini, the 0 hour has passed. The 10 years are up. Have you reached a decision?
Yes. Houdini did not come through. I now reverently turn out the light. It is finished. Good night, Harry.
Now, the legend has it that at that moment, there was a huge thunderstorm that lasted for about 5 minutes. The rain came down, it was thunder and lightning, and then just as quickly as it had approached, it disappeared. Maybe this is Harry's way. If you were the greatest magician that ever walked the face of the earth, would you just rattle a tambourine or unlock some handcuffs? No, you would want people to know that you're up in the heavens and that you're there for that moment.
Still, seances continue every Halloween, sometimes in Houdini's boyhood home of Appleton, Wisconsin, sometimes at the Houdini Hall of Fame in Niagara Falls, Ontario. So far, Harry has not attended. In 1953, there was a film of his life starring Tony Curtis as Houdini and Janet Leigh as Bess. The film played fast and loose with the facts, including having Houdini die in the water torture chamber.
I wish it was another woman that took you from me, Harry. That I could fight. This I can't.
Still, nearly 30 years after Houdini's death, the world needed reminding of what it had lost. Perhaps it's because Houdini's real exploits were so fantastic and in memory merged with all those he made up that the myth of Houdini continues to grow. And his appeal continues as well. Maybe because he showed us what we wanted to believe about our power to overcome the odds.
Part of what he was doing was that little bit of the Olympics and the circus that says, look at what an individual can do. I'm going to get really sappy here, but I don't give a damn. If he can escape from that straitjacket, then maybe I can be manager of this store. You know what I mean? And if he can be thrown into a river, maybe I can get my wife and kids out to North Dakota.
He was born 26 years before the turn of the century, died 26 years after it. 26, 26, 52, the number of cards in a deck. It's rather picturesque, I think.
To this day, if you were to stop somebody on the street and say, name a magician, I suspect that before any of the current stars of magic would be named, people would say Houdini, because the name has become synonymous with magic.
Houdini took his final bow in 1926, but the legend sure lives on. Professional magicians and wide-eyed amateurs all honor him as the greatest showman in the history of magic. Could it be that someday we will receive a message from the great Houdini across the great beyond? That'd be his best trick of all.